Okay, good evening. Thank you for all coming out this evening. It's great to see so many people here, so many people interested in Britain's current crisis. I think some of us on the panel, or at least I, would prefer a smaller audience and to be talking about how Britain had voted to remain in the European Union. But we are all here, and it's good to see everybody. I have 3 jobs this evening. 1, I'm going to be moderating the event. 2, I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to the referendum, what happened, and why it came about. And thirdly, and most importantly, I'm going to introduce my colleagues here this evening. So one of our colleagues, Robin Harding, has not arrived yet. Maybe symbolically, he's representing Britain, who's left the European Union already. Next, we have Andy Sharp, who is here from Bloomberg. He is the Korea and Japan politics editor for Bloomberg in Japan. Next, we have James Brown, who's probably familiar to a lot of you. James is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Temple University. Next, we have Alistair Howard, who is Chief Academic Officer, also here at Temple. And on the end, we have Mark Pollock, who's visiting from main campus, Japan. And Mark is a professor of politics and law. So we have a number of different perspectives to look forward to this evening. So what I wanted to do is just to run through briefly a bit of the background to the referendum for those of you who are less familiar with how this came about. And I think the story dates back to the negotiations over the Maastricht Treaty back in the early 1990s. And this treaty was the treaty that put Europe on the path towards greater economic and monetary union. It introduced, for example, the idea of the euro going forward. And this was a very contentious treaty in the UK. It widened divisions that already existed within the Conservative Party about Britain's membership of the European Union. And it caused, when it was ratified in the UK Parliament, a number of headaches for the Prime Minister at the time, John Major. It deepened splits within his party. It actually led to him expelling a number of rebels who were in favour of leaving the European Union from his party. And it also led to him resigning as Prime Minister, as leader of the Conservative Party, and telling his party effectively, put up a candidate against me who's pro-leaving the EU, or stop complaining. And that was supposed to draw a line under the divisions in the Conservative Party. But as we know, that clearly didn't happen. And around the same time as the Maastricht Treaty was being negotiated, a political party emerged in the UK called the Referendum Party. And its reason for being was to seek a referendum. And one of the main figures in this party was Sir James Goldsmith, a billionaire businessman who bankrolled this political party. It did quite poorly in the general election that came up in 1997, but it was very successful at getting the idea of a referendum onto the political agenda. And that the baton for calling for a referendum was really taken up soon after by the UK Independence Party, which was first founded under a different name in 1991. It was renamed the UK Independence Party in 1993. And since its inception, it's also been a party that's main purpose has been to seek the exit of Britain from the European Union. And this party, early in its history, didn't have particularly strong electoral fortunes. It didn't do particularly well in elections. But from the mid-2000s, it started to pick up traction. And it did particularly well in local elections in 2013. And then it actually received the largest number of votes in the European elections for the European Parliament in Britain in 2014. And based on the growing popularity and support for the UK Independence Party, this party was taking a lot of support, both voters and activists from the UK Conservative Party, David Cameron's party. I think one of the reasons that David Cameron decided to call a referendum, or say he would call a referendum in January 2013, was to stem the flow of exodus from his political party to UKIP. So the reason being quite political expediency. And then when Cameron was returned to office in the general election in 2015, the Conservative Party made good on its promise and put forward legislation to enact a referendum for this year. So that's some of the background to how we got to where we are today. So what this slide shows us is the results of the referendum. So figures that probably everybody is familiar with now. When it came to the actual voting in the referendum, approximately 52% of voters voted to leave and 48% of voters voted to remain within the European Union. And turnout in the election was 72%, which is the highest turnout in a national election since the 1992 general election in the UK. So quite a lot of interest in the referendum. The other thing that we see on this graphic is the differences in voting for the two different propositions geographically within the UK. So in terms of colours on the map of the UK here, the darker red represents areas of the country where people voted to leave in larger numbers, and the blue represents where people voted to stay in the European Union. So we can see the heaviest concentration of voters wanting to remain, and indeed a majority wanting to remain, are in Scotland, London, and Northern Ireland. And this is leading people to conclude that potentially this referendum is going to further fracture the United Kingdom and lead to stronger divisions politically within the country, which is already quite riven with political differences. And I think when it comes to looking at voting intentions and demographic issues and how these affected voters' decision-making, two issues besides geography seem to account for some of the major differences. One of them is education, which also to some degree correlates with income levels. People with higher educational attainment generally voting in larger numbers to remain, those with lower levels of educational attainment voting in larger numbers to leave. And age was also quite an important factor. So younger people tending to vote to stay in, older people, especially those over 65, voting to leave. So we can see this as a generational issue in the UK as well. And then finally, what next? Mostly I'm going to leave this to my colleagues to discuss because it's the hard question, and I think they will give some interesting insights into what might happen next. But one of the things that you're probably hearing bandied around a lot in the media at the moment is Article 50. Everyone's talking about Article 50. In the same way as after the financial crisis, lots of people suddenly started talking about subprime mortgages. This has become the sort of buzzword of the referendum. So Article 50 is the article within the Lisbon Treaty, which is one of the treaties governing the conduct, and it's one of the constitutional treaties, for example, of the European Union. This is the article that dictates how the process of exit will work for any country that wants to leave the European Union. It's actually quite short if you look at it online, and the EU produces all of its articles online for us to look at. So I took a quick look in preparation for today and was surprised by how very short it actually is, which kind of undermines the argument that the EU is this big bureaucratic nightmare. In this case, the details are actually quite short. So for a member state to actually leave the European Union, it has to inform the Council, the President of the European Council, that it wants to leave. Once that's done, it triggers a 2-year exit process, a process of negotiations between the EU and the state which is seeking to leave. And until the Prime Minister of the UK actually triggers this process by formally telling the President of the Council that Britain wants to leave, this process doesn't start. And Cameron has not yet invoked Article 50. What he said is he will wait for the new Prime Minister, who takes office probably in October, to trigger the process once there's been a period of reflection and that individual has identified what they want to see going forward as being the relationship between Britain and the EU. But we're seeing a lot of leaders from within the European Union itself and some leaders of the various nation states within Europe saying that they would like to see Britain actually moving much more quickly towards triggering Article 50, because the current situation is leading to a lot of instability. Okay, so Robin has now joined us. We were wondering if you'd become our first victim of exit. So each of the panelists is going to give a quick 5-minute overview of what they think are some of the most salient things coming out of the referendum and the results, and also maybe some indication of where they think we are going to go as we go forward, maybe some of the causes of people voting for leave. And each of them will speak based on their own particular areas of expertise. So I think we're going to just go down the line and start with Robin. Thank you.
So thank you, and apologies for arriving late. We actually moved offices today. So I've been moving boxes and then being welcomed into our new office, and then I've rushed over. So apologies. It's fantastic to see so many people, which I guess just speaks to the fact that Brexit has shockingly happened and become an issue that's affecting the entire globe. There are so many things that we could talk about. It's hard to think what to say in 5 minutes. We could talk about why the polling was disastrously wrong. We could talk about the difference between the component UK nations. We could talk about where the European Union has gone wrong along the way. We could talk about the decline of globalization and what Brexit means for that. We could probably go on all night, and I could go on all night, but I've only got 5 minutes. So I'm going to take a deep breath and just speak briefly on 3 points. So first on the economy, which is my own particular area of expertise. And I don't know if you've seen the movie The Big Short, where the movie ends with the guy who called the crisis and some man who works for Bear Stearns, and they're having a debate on a panel. And during the panel, everyone's checking their mobile phones and it turns out that Bear Stearns' stock is collapsing, even as they're speaking. So I urge you to check your phones. As I was coming in here, the pound was in free fall. The nature of the economic shock from from Brexit is a particular one. It's not like the shock of 2008. It's not a financial crisis. It's hard to tell exactly how bad it will be, but it's a very traditional kind of economic crisis. If it happens, it'll be a currency crisis. That's because Britain has a 7% of GDP current account deficit, i.e. every year we consume 7% more of GDP than we produce. And we rely on foreign countries to either buy our assets, like the Financial Times newspaper, or to buy our debt, our gilts, or buy property. And that financing is what allows the UK to consume as it does. So the short-run consequences of this are just very dependent on whether foreign investors retain enough confidence in the pound to keep buying it at a reasonable exchange rate. If they don't, what will happen is quite simple. The pound will fall. That will create inflation in Britain because prices are pushed up, import prices. We're already seeing it happen for gasoline or petrol. The price rises will force the Bank of England to raise interest rates. That will prompt a recession, and in due course, the pound would be brought under control. But that would be very painful for Britain. So I think that's the short-run question now about the UK economy. The long-run question is also fairly simple. We know what the UK economy looked like in the 1970s before it was in the European Union. We've seen these estimates of very big long-run effects if the UK is outside the European Union. And I think they're perfectly plausible. It depends on the terms of exit, which is another of these topics that we could discuss. But I think severe damage to the economy is entirely plausible. God, so much I want to say. A second quick thought about the coalitions that voted for Brexit and voted against Brexit in the UK. What strikes me about them is how closely they resemble the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States. So those who voted for exit were a coalition of the wealthy on the right, who believe in free markets and have a very, often libertarian view of democracy. And in the UK, that manifested itself as opposition to the European Union. And they were in coalition with many, many working-class white people who felt left behind by the modern world. And that just resembles the Republican coalition in the US so closely. And then the coalition that voted Remain in the UK was educated, urban, those and minorities, those comfortable and succeeding from the modern economy. And that very closely resembles the Democratic coalition in the United States. There's a lot you could say about that, but I only want to make one observation, What worries me about that is that UK politics and the UK political system cannot accommodate those divisions. It cuts across the existing UK party system completely. So the Labour Party combines sort of urban lefties, university professors, teachers with the working class white, while the Conservative Party combines rural, more elderly voters with the business community and those sort of more libertarian right-wing voters. So the structure of UK politics completely cuts across the structure of who voted in this referendum and how they voted, and that will make it very hard to sort out. So one final point. To me, what's profound about this referendum, what shocked me, what's made me deeply unhappy, is that this very possibly heralds the breakup of the United Kingdom. We've already seen the move towards Scotland holding a second referendum. I'm English, I come from the north of England, but if you were asked me, where do you come from, I'd say I'm British. And I very much fear that Britain, my country, is dying. And I feel that deeply and profoundly in a number of ways. So people are thinking about the economic consequences of this, but to me, this is about my own country, which is on the verge of disappearing. So it's very profound. You know, there may be no more important event in my lifetime for me and for the British nation. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, a good evening from me as well. This is Andy Sharp. Thanks for turning out. The moment I realised how big an issue the Brexit, the referendum was just earlier this month when I arrived at Manchester Airport in the north of England after a long flight from Tokyo. And I was queuing up with my family, and me and my wife, my 2 kids, we were walking up to line to the immigration officer. And then the immigration officer starts talking to me. He goes, "Oh, where have you flown from, sir?" "Tokyo." "What do you do?" "I'm a journalist." "What do you think about the Brexit?" I'm like, whoa. I didn't give my opinion at the time, but it really made me think, about how big an issue this is if the immigration officer is asking me this before I enter the country. And it was spent 2 weeks of just talking to people, and this was 90% of the conversation. But anyway, this isn't about, I'm going to talk a little bit about Japan now and what this Brexit means now for the Japanese economy, Japanese companies, the political picture here. And I'll try and keep it pretty brief because there's still quite a lot to talk about. The main thing now I feel is just right now is the short-term firefighting. We saw on Friday, the pound weakened massively, the yen therefore weakening, strengthening a lot based on this, and the yen's at the front line of this, given that it's a safe haven currency. So there's been emergency meetings today between Mr. Abe, Mr. Aso, the Bank of Japan deputy governor, maybe Mr. Kuroda again tomorrow, and they're coming up with all these options and ideas about what they can. Well, we don't know what they're talking about in the meetings, but there are several things they could be talking about. They could be talking about direct currency intervention, like Japan, really just trying to keep its yen from getting too strong, otherwise the old Abenomics dream dies. Also, there's central bank currency swap agreements that could be used at any point in time, essentially, intervention, but done on a global economy scale. So there's many, many options they have. Also, there could be, in the next few weeks, if the yen continues to strengthen, there could be an emergency Bank of Japan meeting, more monetary easing, even lower negative rates. There are so many things the Japanese government and monetary authorities could be doing over the next few weeks. So that's one possibly interesting story that's coming up. Another thing is that Mr. Abe has already, with the election starting on the 10th of July, he's already mentioned the Brexit over the weekend as a good reason to have a strong and stable Japanese government. He's looking at what's happening in the UK, and he's saying we need to have the people we trust, the Jiminto, the LDP, you need to have these people in here. Whereas, of course, the opposition are using the stock prices crashing, the yen strengthening heavily as another sign yet that Abenomics has failed. So they're already drawing the Japanese election battlegrounds a little bit on this Brexit. One more aspect as well for the Japanese economy is London itself as a financial hub. We've already had several Japanese financial institutions already come out and saying, they're considering their options for staying in London or moving out. We've had Daiwa Securities. They've got about 400 people in London. They've already said they may need to form new operations elsewhere in Europe. Also, Nomura have said the same sort of thing. So, for these Japanese banks, and of course globally, bank stocks are just, nosediving right now. I mean, could there be another banking crisis? I don't know, but that's something we've got to be looking out for. And liquidity is going to be short for these banks. Also, we have the non-financials, the big manufacturers, Nissan, Toyota, Hitachi. I mean, they have big production bases in the UK, so they're going to be very, very worried about the Brexit, whether, there's going to be some trade barriers going up, there's going to be some tariffs going in if Britain leaves the European Union, and will these manufacturing bases be shifted to elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the world from the UK? So, there's a big implication there, and this is just from Japan. You've got to think about countries around the world, other companies, Chinese, American, other companies from around the world could easily be thinking, not just yet, but thinking long term about whether they continue to produce and manufacture in the UK. So there's quite a lot of factors here to take into account for the companies and the banks from Japan. And finally is trade. As we know, Japan has been going through this long, tedious process of negotiating a free trade deal with the European Union, which of course Britain was part of. Not anymore. So, if Britain, as it says, is going to do free trade with the whole world, it's going to have to, form its own separate trade deal with Japan. Problem is, Japan's got the TPP. It's still trying to get through. It's got the deal with Europe. Where's Britain going to be on this list of trade deals for Japan? Probably down the pecking order, I would imagine, once the Brexit, fully takes place. So anyway, these are just 3 or 4 areas from a Japanese perspective that could be affected by the vote last week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name's James Brown, Associate Professor at TUJ, and I'm going to be focusing just in these few minutes on a question that many people have been asking over this weekend, which is, how the hell did this happen? And it really is an amazing set of events which have taken place. Over the last few months, we have heard endless economic warnings about the disastrous economic effect that this would have. And yet, despite this, the majority of the voters in this referendum have opted for uncertainty, have opted for the unknown. And it's a big question. How on earth did this occur? And so I'm just going to offer 4 ideas, really, very partial answers. And perhaps some of you would be interested in commenting on them later on. So we've already heard that part of the coalition voting for Leave seems to have been made up by lower middle class voters, working class voters, less well-educated voters. And what they have clearly expressed in this vote is a deep dissatisfaction with politics as usual, with the elite-led politics which they feel does not represent their views. And so I think that there have been several factors which have led to this strong dissatisfaction over the last few years. So the first one is the Big Bang expansion of the EU in 2004. So many of you will remember this is when the EU enlarged, adding 10 additional states, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe. And at that time, the then Labour government took the decision to allow the immediate right to work for those new member states within the UK. And there was a, well, now kind of infamous prediction of the number of workers who would be likely to come to the UK making use of this provision. And it was that there would be approximately 13,000 per year. The actual number turned out to be closer to, well, it was 423,000 up until 2012. So in the 8 years after that accession. So an enormous influx of migrants from Eastern Europe. Many regard that as a very good thing. Economic statistics suggest that there are many economic benefits, but for those who were in a more precarious position within the labour force, that was clearly not regarded as a good thing. They saw it as threats to their income, to their employment, and also very significant cultural change. Large cities in Britain, of course, have been multicultural for quite a long time, but with this expansion of the EU in 2004, it was areas of the UK that previously had remained really quite homogenous that ended up being significantly changed. So I think that that led to a lot of backlash. My second point is to do with the economic crisis of 2008 and the bank bailouts. We've moved on very much from that period of time now, but I think that the anger within sectors of the UK population remain. The perception that the government looked after the banks, bailed them out, and did not nearly so much to look after the interests of the working class. And I think that that was particularly important in that when there were all of these warnings prior to the Brexit vote, that this would be disastrous, in particular for the City of London, for the big banks, I think that a lot of voters thought, well, who cares? That wouldn't really make too much difference to me. My third point is to do with the electoral system in the UK, and that a number of voters have been expressing strong dissatisfaction with the status quo for some time, with the EU in particular, and yet their opinions have not perhaps been fully reflected by the way that the Parliament has been made up. And what I have in mind here in particular is the result of the 2015 general election and the vote share and the number of seats that went to UKIP. So in that election, just shy of 4 million voters voted for the UK Independence Party, about 13% of the total vote, and they got 1 seat out of 650. In comparison, the Lib Dems, who did very poorly in that election, 8% of the vote, but they ended up with 8 seats. Even more strikingly, the Scottish National Party, which had about 1.5 million votes, less than 5% of the total, ended up with 56 seats. So that leaves an awful lot of UKIP voters, no doubt furious by the fact that their anti-EU views have not been fully reflected within the Parliament. And my final point is a slightly different one. It's about the failure to make the case for the benefits of the European Union within the UK. There is an extraordinary lack of knowledge of the EU within the UK. Very few people know about how it really works, what are its benefits, and there is just a poorly informed hostility to the EU, which we've clearly seen reflected on Thursday. And this, I think, is also in part because of the fear of many pro-EU, or at least moderately pro-EU politicians to make the case for the EU. Instead, it's been too straightforward for them to blame problems on the EU and not speak up for its benefits. And I think we've seen the results of that this week. And indeed, when I think back over the last few years in British politics, I really struggle to think of any major politicians who you can really say were greatly kind of pro-EU. Kenneth Clarke might be one, but not such an important kind of politician over the last few years. And then the only truly important one is Tony Blair. Tony Blair, seen as very, very pro-EU, made a famous speech within the European Parliament in 2005, describing himself as a passionate pro-European. But he's about the only one. And now he is one of the most reviled politicians within the UK. And I think that a number of politicians should perhaps look at themselves in the UK and think that perhaps at an earlier stage they should have spoken up for the advantages of being a member of this club. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks for being here. It's nice to see so many of our TUJ students here as well. Welcome. You know, I too was appalled by this result, although I have to say I wasn't paying very close attention. I'm a dual national, British and American, and I suppose have been gone from Britain for so long that I perhaps wasn't paying the attention I should. But now I've woken up and I see that my passport is no longer what it was. My kids won't be able to travel freely in the EU, possibly, or at least work in the EU. And my parents, who live in France, are uncertain about their future. So, I mean, it's a disaster, particularly for those of us in the cosmopolitan bourgeois world, I'm afraid. And that's an important point, I think, that the people who voted for exit could not care less about me, and probably rightfully so. But it's also bad for TUJ students, of course, because as the yen strengthens, their tuition becomes more expensive, and we become, at least in the global market, less competitive. So we're in shock here at TUJ as well. Hopefully that will be ameliorated somewhat. A couple of things. First off, I think it's safe to say that Cameron and especially Boris Johnson have long ago unleashed demons that they are unable to control, in the same way that the Republican right in the United States unleashed anti-government sentiment and made it acceptable to talk about how awful, in almost existential terms, government is. The anti-EU forces, or actually people who just want to reinforce their own place in the Conservative Party, unleashed and made it acceptable an ongoing critique of European bureaucrats, unelected European officials, and so on. And now it's come back to haunt them, I think, and it's very, very dangerous. The best, so I'm a political economist, and the best analysis I've read, I think, is by Alan Finlayson, who pointed out that there are really both cultural and economic things going on behind the vote. And the first, you know, in response to James's point, making the case for the EU was something that should have been going on all along. The referendum was not about the EU, I think. The referendum was about the establishment. And by that, I don't necessarily mean the wealthy. But the Finlayson pointed out that there really, this is really a response to globalization and neoliberalization, if you like. So he divides the two major sort of problems into the cultural and the economic. And from that derives four sets of voters. There are people who win or like the cultural changes brought by globalization, including the European Union, and benefit as well from the economic. So these are your elites. These are people like us, I think, here, who are happy with different kinds of food and different accents and not worried about people wearing different kinds of clothes, and have the money to travel and enjoy more than a package holiday at the Costa del Sol. But we also benefit economically. So we're obviously Remain voters. And then there are those who like the cultural stuff because, hey, diversity is good, right? But maybe don't benefit as much as they could economically, but they think they will. So these are younger people, especially students and young professionals, perhaps, who aspire to economic success in this world where they're increasingly, their labor is increasingly having less value because of the growth of the global labor supply. So those people are kind of on balance Remain folks. Then there are people who have benefited economically from globalization, but don't like the cultural changes. And the left, I think, have never really been able to address the cultural problems. And the fact that cultural change is difficult for people, and now I'm 50, I increasingly see that it is difficult. I think of England as, and Britain, it is England actually for me, I'm from the north of England as well. I think of England as a place where we have wonderful beer, great cricket, but we also have wonderful music from the Afro-Caribbean, and we have great food and wonderful people from the South Asian continent. But I'm astonished when I go back at the number of Central and Eastern Europeans. I have nothing against Central and Eastern Europeans, but I'm aware that there's been change, and that's a little bit jarring. And I don't think we found a way to talk about that. So I think that the people who I know in Britain who were leavers were bourgeois, they might be, since I'm doing fairly well, but they were people who travel in France and who spend, they're relatively cultured people at a sort of upper Daily Mail level, perhaps. But these folks voted to leave, which is astonishing. Then there are people who have lost both culturally and economically, if you like, or who are unhappy culturally and economically. And these are your working class, the really sort of disenfranchised people who haven't managed to eke out a successful recovery from deindustrialization, or they're the petty bourgeois who have managed to form their own small businesses but are not happy about paying tax, even though they're relatively lowly taxed. So those are the four main groups, and then there's this sort of ideological group which was mentioned earlier, who are your libertarians who couldn't care less about culture because they're libertarians, but they love globalization and they want more, right? So these are the people who are able to make the case against Europe most effectively ideologically. But so you've got these folks, and unfortunately there's just not enough of the winners culturally or economically, and we see the result. A couple of things, though. It's not really just about wealth. The elite that we're talking about here are people, I think, who have benefited from globalization and understand that globalization brings gross benefits, and we're constantly reminded of this by the economists, but then who turn around and refuse the distributive changes or distributive reallocations which might make globalization easier to bear for the losers. So on the one hand, you win, but you don't compensate the losers. These are also people who benefit from the transactional aspects of the economy. For example, banking, the legal profession. These people win on the upside and the downside. They're there when contracts are written, and they're the intermediaries. These are also, the winners also include, if you like, the professional classes of I guess what Boris might call the intelligentsia, or one scholar called the cosmocrats. These are people who do what David Graeber calls the bullshit jobs. Pardon my language, but it's in The Economist, so I think I can say it, right? So these are people who know that their work is unnecessary. They like their work, but they're not really doing anything that a plumber could respect. They're just a source of tremendous resentment, and they may be multicultural, but they're not. They're isolated in London and Bristol. They're the winners, and they're great people. Some of my best friends, but they certainly have. They should have seen this coming. So just to wrap up, why didn't they see it coming? Well, I hate to come back to the bearded man, but all of this is about the contradictions of capitalism, okay? I mean, all of this is perfectly understandable, not from a liberal perspective that globalization is good, but maybe we should pay a bit more tax to pay off the losers. That side's losing anyway, but they don't really understand what's going on. The center labor folks, the new labor folks, can't understand it either. The conservatives probably understand it but don't care. The Corbynites understand it exactly. That is, the old left know exactly what's going on, but they're incapable of communicating it to anybody in a way which is attractive, right? So, Corbyn makes a lot of sense to me. One of James Peters, is James here? James Peters one of our students posted on Facebook that he makes a lot of sense. He does make a lot of sense, that's right, but he won't win an election, I'm afraid. So once again, the Marxists are right, but we're all the losers.
Mark Pollack from Temple, Maine campus. We've heard from a number of British experts about the sources of the British vote and its fallout in Britain. My area of expertise is the European Union itself, and I want to talk about what Brexit means for the EU, but before I do that, I want to immediately undermine my own credibility by making two embarrassing admissions. The first admission is that when Alex invited me to participate in this, I was pretty sure that the first sentence of my comments was going to be, well, the threat of Brexit is behind us. And After that, I was going to continue, but the EU still has a lot of problems facing it, including an ongoing debt crisis, the debate over fiscal austerity, the migration crisis, a terrorism problem, the external security threat posed by a resurgent Russia, and on and on and on. And I still think all of that is true, and I think those crises are still there, but they've been put on the back burner by the immediate crisis of the Brexit vote. The second embarrassing admission I want to make is that over the past month or two, I've had a series of articles, good articles, come across my computer screen with titles like, "Here's how a Brexit might play out." And I would say, that's purely speculative. That's not going to happen. And I would close the window. So now here we are, and we all need to start thinking about these questions. So I want to focus, like lots of other folks, on 3 points about the impact of this Brexit vote on the EU looking ahead. The first point is about the immediate response to Brexit, Article 50 and all of that. The second point is about the broader response. Where do the sort of leaders of the rump EU go without Britain? And the third is about the prospect of contagion of Brexit beyond Great Britain. So first point about the immediate response to the vote is we can see immediately emerging over the last 3 days a debate between what we might call hawks and doves. And the hawks in Brussels say the EU needs to make it hurt for the British. That's the language that they explicitly use. They want to insist that Britain issue its Article 50 notification right away, start the 2-year timeline to withdrawal, and drive a really hard bargain to make it clear to other states that exit won't be pleasant. By contrast, the doves, and I'm thinking here in particular of Angela Merkel, say that being too hard on Britain will only poison the relationship, it will make the EU seem vindictive, and it'll ultimately boomerang on the EU. And perhaps not surprisingly, Merkel's view seems to be the one that's winning over the last couple of days, and I think that's the position going to be taken by the European Council when it meets tomorrow and Wednesday. What's striking to me in this context is how little hope is being placed in Brussels in the possibility that the UK electorate will experience remorse. Wake up tomorrow and sort of realize, rethink their position, realize we didn't think it was going to be this bad. We were casting a protest vote, but we didn't think we were going to get this. The EU appears to believe that the Brexit, the remorse possibility is a fantasy, and the only real question is, how is Britain going to leave and how soon? The second question is a little bit about the longer-term, broader response that the EU has to a Brexit. When the EU has experienced past crises, as it has done repeatedly through its history, EU governments have usually responded with some big new initiative to try and regain momentum. My friend Dan Kellerman calls this failing forward, right? You fail and you respond by a bold new measure to deepen integration. And I think this is the position that is instinctively taken by good Europeans in Brussels, but it's clearly manifestly inappropriate to the current climate in Europe. Donald Tusk is the president of the European Council, and a couple of weeks ago he said, if you want people to massively reject Europe, just keep on demanding more Europe. And today he is being crowned as sort of the king of the Euro realists for having said this. Joseph Joffe, the German commentator, was even more blunt in writing after the vote. On the one hand, he wrote, "Not since the Germans voted Hitler into power has a democratic electorate inflicted so much harm on its glorious history and prospects." So clearly disapproving of the vote, but he also cautioned the Eurocrats in Brussels, don't even think about more integration right now. So whatever comes out of Brexit, and I do certainly believe that the EU will survive, it will not be another great leap forward in the history of European integration. And the third and quickest point is about the risk of contagion. Because as much as Brexit itself, EU member states fear a contagion effect in the other member states from Brexit. And the fear is not so much that other EU governments will want to leave, but rather that far-right, Eurosceptic, anti-immigrant parties in other member states will be emboldened to insist that they also have a right to their own referendum. So it's been said a number of times over the past 3 days that David Cameron sort of bet the proverbial farm. He bet not only his own job, but Britain's EU membership and perhaps the unity of the United Kingdom, as Robin said, on the British referendum and lost everything. An alternative metaphor would be to say that, and again, this has already been hinted at, Cameron sort of unintentionally opened up a Pandora's box of anti-globalist, anti-immigrant, working class populism of a sort that looks, as an American, looks very, very familiar to those of us who've watched the rise of Donald Trump. Now, that's a little bit of an oversimplification. Alex is quite right that the Brexit vote is more complicated than that. But that's certainly the way it feels watching from the United States. And I know that in Brussels, the fear is that the effects of opening that Pandora's box may be felt in other member states before we're all done.
Before we move on to audience Q&A, I'd just like to ask the panel a few questions to draw out a bit more about some of the key topics that we've touched upon. I think probably we've had enough of what James referred to as what the hell happened, and maybe we should focus on what's going to happen going forward. So my first question to all of you, and feel free to jump in any order that you wish, is will it happen? So some have started to raise the prospect of various mechanisms that could be put into place to prevent Britain from actually going forward and starting the Article 50 process. So for example, the Scottish Parliament perhaps vetoing the decision, or a second referendum, or a vote in Parliament saying that Britain will remain rather than respecting the referendum, or maybe even a general election with a party standing on a platform of staying in. So are any of these four potential scenarios goers, do you think? Or alternative scenarios that might see Britain staying in?
I don't know. I think everything is possible. I think that we're in completely uncharted territory. It would be exceptionally difficult to overturn this referendum anytime soon, but we know that there's going to be an extended period of negotiation. These negotiations won't begin straight away. We know about this issue to do with Article 50. So we have probably 2.5 years. And 2.5 years is a very long time. And there is potential for a change during that period. So at the moment, there is a petition going around in the UK, gathering signatures asking for another referendum. Now, I don't think that's going to go anywhere because it's too early. You can't simply reject the votes of millions and millions of British people. But after 2 years of negotiation, if it turns out that the alternative is so dissatisfactory, then it's possible, I think, that with the backing of a popular vote, so after a general election, it is conceivable, at least, that a new government would push for a referendum, a second referendum, and campaign to reject the initial vote. Now, very difficult to take place, but I say it's not impossible.
So on this question of whether whether this is possible, one of my old professors, Andy Moravchik, has made the argument that this is all kabuki theater, and that even someone like a Boris Johnson is just using this as bargaining leverage to get a better deal out of the EU. He's playing a long game, and maybe that will work. And what strikes me about this, there was another referendum held last year in Greece about the austerity terms that the EU was offering Greece. And the Syriza government held a referendum and was overwhelmingly backed by the people. 61% of the Greek public said, we don't want austerity anymore, we reject the EU's terms. The EU did not budge an inch, and Syriza ultimately just caved in and accepted austerity. And it strikes me that the EU is not in the mood to give Boris Johnson a victory, however much they might want Britain to stay in. So I find that scenario hard to picture, but again, maybe when tempers cool over the space of 2.5 years, I can imagine it's a possibility.
Let me add a couple of quick points. I agree very much with my colleagues that quickly reversing this is very difficult. The point I made earlier about the party system in Britain is one of the things which I think is the biggest obstacle for this, because the Conservative Party, having legislated for this referendum, is basically bound to follow its results, and they have a majority in Parliament and will do for the next 4 years. So I find it hard to imagine the process by which this gets reversed. Another thing that bothers me is, even if it is possible to reverse this in 2 years' time, it may be too late to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom. So it's not as simple as just, turning around. Something's happened now, and I doubt you can go 100% back to where you start. And then finally, just on this petition, I think that saying now you want to reverse it is totally counterproductive. If there's any way to insult and disrespect that 52% of voters who said they want to leave, then say, oh no, sort of cancel that. We'll just have another referendum until you give us the right result. And if you want to guarantee that that won't happen, then saying that you want another referendum now is exactly the way to achieve that result.
So a question following on from that is that if Britain does invoke Article 50, which it seems likely that it will have to at some point, if not until maybe October or maybe somewhat later, what kind of relationship do we think Britain will be seeking with the EU going forward? Do we think Britain will be looking to become like Norway in the single market, or do we think it will be going down the route of having no access to the single market and being completely outside? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Alex just looked at me. So on this question, so there is the Norwegian option, which is the European Economic Area. And it's a sort of natural thing to think about. But members of the EEA commit themselves to taking on the entire acquis communautaire, right? The 100,000 pages of legislation from the EU, not only the 100,000 pages that Great Britain has participated in negotiating, but all future legislation. And the leaders of the Brexit campaign have made it quite clear that they're not interested in that. They're trying to get back British sovereignty, not give it up. On the other hand, and I think this is somewhat irresponsible, there's, Boris Johnson and others have sort of said, but we'll keep access to the internal market. And as of right now, I don't see in Brussels any interest in giving Britain access to the internal market on better conditions than everyone else has.
They want to jump in or same? Mm-hmm. James, this one's really tailor-made for you. Do you think it's more likely now that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom?
100%. That I'm from Scotland. I'm from Edinburgh, and I was very much in favour of the UK remaining part of the UK, Scotland remaining part of the UK. But even I'm now thinking that actually, maybe Scottish independence wouldn't be such a bad thing. Previously, the situation was that a vote for Scottish independence was a vote for economic uncertainty, a leap into the unknown. Now it's the status quo, which is the remaining with the UK, which seems to have more uncertainty connected with it. There have been a few polls conducted already on whether Scottish voters have changed their mind. You might remember that the result of the referendum on Scottish independence was 55% in favour of remaining part of the UK. Now, it's very kind of initial polls, and we know that we can't always trust the polls, but it's now showing maybe about 65% would consider voting in favour of independence for Scotland. Now, Scotland would have to potentially move quite quickly. Many of things we don't know, but Scotland wouldn't want to negotiate membership of the European Union as if it was joining as a new member. They would want rather to remain a member of the EU, and the rest of the UK would leave. Now, in order to do that, they would have to move quickly and do it during the 2-year period. So that means that I think it's highly likely we would have a second referendum within a couple of years. And if that takes place, then I fully expect that the separatist side would win.
Can I just follow up with a question for you on that? Obviously, during the Scottish referendum, there was a lot of talk saying, this was like a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get independence, etc., etc. And we're saying just now as well, of course, if we go for another EU vote, another Brexit vote, it's too soon. Of course, the scenario has changed a lot, of course, with the Britain leaving the EU. But still, surely the allegations could be slung that this is just far too soon for yet another Scottish vote.
Yeah, it's a good point that they would have to be careful about their timing. If the Scottish National Party were to hold a second referendum and they lost again, then they really couldn't move again. So they would want to wait until they had seen polls over a number of months showing more than 60% consistently favouring independence. But they can't wait forever. It would be somewhat difficult to make the case that a second referendum would be justified on independence, but I think they could make it. In fact, we've already heard it to an extent in that Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has said that the UK that voters selected to remain a part of no longer exists. That everything has changed as a result of that referendum, and therefore it would be entirely justified to hold a second independence referendum.
Now, I don't know if this question actually falls within anybody's area of expertise, but there's been a lot of speculation about Scotland, and less has been said about Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland is a place that also voted to remain within the European Union. What do you think might be some of the impact of the vote to leave on the peace process in Northern Ireland, on the UK's relations with the Republic of Ireland? Do we see this playing out in any significant way? Maybe this is why it's not been discussed so much in the mainstream media. Okay, well,
there is an immediate. Sorry, I'm not at all an expert on Northern Ireland, but I mean there is an immediate problem which has been observed in the press, and that is that the border between Northern Ireland, or up between Ulster and the rest of Ireland, is open now, and that's not a problem within the EU, but it would have to close if Britain left the EU. So that would change the terms, if you like, of the settlement and the easy exchange of labor between the two, I think. Oh, it'd have to be renegotiated.
And wasn't, of course, I'm not an expert either, but wasn't the Good Friday Agreement, etc., power sharing all conducted under European law? And maybe you can, Mark, you can probably fill us in on that. Another problem as well I can see is just, the troubles which we had in the 80s, the 70s and 80s. Might they not rear their heads again? Might this trigger some more nationalism in the south and the north of Ireland? Could this, potentially, go in a really, really negative direction in terms of another conflict? I don't know. It's but there's a whole bunch of questions to be asked.
For those of you who are more economics and trade focused, so I'm looking down the end of the table a little more, do we think the EU will continue to be Britain's most significant trading partner, or do we think the UK should now be looking to other places to expand its trading relationships, and who might those new trading partners or more significant trading partners going forward be? Well, I don't know if Mark, if you have any views on trade as well.
I'm happy to tackle that. I find it impossible to imagine that anywhere other than Europe can be Britain's biggest trading partner, because it's so big, it's so close, and we just spent 40 or 50 years building supply chains that go around Europe. So just because you say we're not part of the European Union anymore, nothing changes like that. So I find it impossible to imagine there's any alternative, really.
So, I mean, from the perspective of services trade, there's a real problem. And also from the perspective of inward investment. If you think about what Britain has to offer outside Europe, in other words, a Britain that's not part of the European Union, what does it have? The infrastructure is diabolical. The workforce is not productive. frankly. I mean, productivity is a real problem in Britain. Let's put it nicely. Productivity is a problem there. What it has to offer is stability and market access. And now we don't have stability, and we may not have market access in 2 years. So I think that, I suppose we'll still have low taxes as long as people put up with it.
Sorry, I want to come back and defend the UK a bit. The infrastructure has its problems. It's absolutely true that the education of the workforce is an issue, but it's still one of the richest and most productive economies in the world, and that is for a reason. It's not a complete basket case. The problem is that more than almost anywhere else in Europe, we have specialized our economy to function only within the European Union. We've built up a financial services sector which relies on the rest of Europe. We've got car plants, but unlike in Germany where they're locally integrated, they rely on European supply chains. So Britain is actually one of the most integrated into Europe economies there is, which is why leaving is such complete economic suicide.
So I'll just ask one final question so we can open Q&A up to the audience. Do we think Prime Minister Boris is avoidable? Don't need to go any further.
One hesitates to mention betting odds, given how badly they got the poll itself wrong. But Johnson, and I don't like calling him Boris, let's call him Johnson like we call most politicians, is below 50% to win at present. So he definitely can be avoided. The betting public thinks he will be, but he's the favourite.
Anybody else? Nobody in a betting mood?
I think that there's a real chance still that it will be Boris Johnson, that many within the Conservative Party at the moment are looking for a viable alternative, but there isn't really anyone particularly that stands out. That George Osborne certainly doesn't seem like he would be the one. Theresa May, I don't think so. That it's very difficult to see who could oppose Boris Johnson, especially because of the rules of the Conservative Party for electing a new leader. That, if I've remembered this correctly, it does now give a considerable role to members of the party, more than it used to in the past. And Boris Johnson does well with the grassroots of the party. So that being the case, I think that whilst it's not a certainty, there's still a very high probability that it will be Boris Johnson.
That's, of course, if Boris still wants the job.
So shell-shocked on Friday, I thought, at the press conference. Okay, I'm sure there are lots of questions from the audience, so I would like to open it up to everybody. We have one very fast question here. Yeah, please, sir. If you could come up to the mic and say your name and any affiliation that you have, please.
My name is Fukuhara. I'm in financial services. Talking about Boris Johnson, unless there will be a general election whereby he is running to become a member of the parliament, how is it possible for non-parliament member to become the next prime minister? Because as I understand it, I've been reading a lot of British and Scottish and Irish papers this weekend, but I don't hear much about having a general election at the moment. So that's my question.
Want to jump in on that? Yeah, he is. Yeah.
But he just resigned as a mayor.
He was elected as a member of parliament even when he was still mayor. He's been simultaneous for the last year.
So that's possible in the UK?
Yeah.
That is possible, yeah. It's not like with the American president who's elected from the Senate and then has to give up that position. No, it's different. Please, yeah. Sir.
Byron Seagon with the U.S. Pharmaceutical Company. Two questions. In the short term, from 2008, how much responsibility does Angela Merkel have for having created the economic hardship in Europe and particularly in the UK due to her austerity policies and her rush to immigration and refugees? And I'd just like to see, the Germans' role seems to be disproportionate in inflicting pain across Europe. And number two, as an American, our interests in Europe are basically continental and countering the Russians, I believe. How quickly should we throw the UK under the double-decker bus and realign our alliances with the Germans? Thank you.
Angela and buses. Anyone?
Not necessarily looking to defend Angela Merkel, but so with respect to the two issues that you mentioned, first, austerity. There's no question Angela Merkel is associated with austerity throughout Europe and despised for it in much of the southern tier. But British austerity has been self-imposed by the Conservative Party. So I don't think you can blame that on Merkel. And as for immigration, I think here we have to make a distinction between immigration of EU nationals and non-EU nationals. Immigration of EU nationals is something that Great Britain signed on to over 40 years ago and is a responsibility of membership. It's wildly unpopular, but that can't be put on Merkel. And of course, Great Britain is not in Schengen, and Great Britain has taken very few, relatively few, compared to, say, Germany, immigrants. And so it doesn't seem to me that non-EU immigration can be placed at her door either. So I would defend Merkel and the Germans on this one.
So let me add something quickly. I think you can indirectly blame Merkel because weak economic conditions in Greece and across southern Europe is one of the main things that has sent so many EU migrants to the UK in recent years. I think that has played a role. How quickly should the US throw Britain under a bus in terms of its international relations? Very quickly.
Also, if I may, a very quick point that I suppose you could place some blame at Merkel's door in addition to do with the deal that was offered for the UK. So if you remember how it was supposed to work for Cameron, it was negotiate some kind of concessions from the European Union, then tell the British voters, we got a better deal, put that to a vote and win. Now, the deal that was offered to the UK, they tried to dress it up as looking more impressive than it was, but it was pretty clear that it wasn't significant concessions. Perhaps if more concessions were given, then that might have made a difference to the vote. However, that was seen as politically impossible within the rest of the EU. As for the special relationship, I'm not sure that much will change immediately. I mean, Britain still is valuable in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of having a big military. That doesn't, well, relatively big military, that doesn't change overnight.
Okay. I'm going to take a couple of questions from the back. The lady with your hand up at the back. I think it's a lady. I see a female face. I'm not sure if the hand is connected. I hope it is.
I'm a student at TUJ, and I have a pretty basic question. We've talked a lot about negative effects of the Brexit. Is there any positive on the short, medium, long run effects or results that comes from this decision?
Are you thinking in general or for the UK in particular?
Politics, economics.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So any positives?
So,
Go on holiday to the UK.
Well, no, I personally struggle to see positives, but if we're going to start paying attention to the fact that very large parts of our societies are suffering an economic malaise and feeling alienated and left behind, and we're going to start doing something about it, then this could be a salutary lesson to Britain and the world. You know, for the country and the polity of the United Kingdom, I really, really struggle. I mean, obviously 52% of people think it's going to be nice to have their independence back from the European Union, and I respect that they feel that way, although I really, really suspect it's not going to turn out how they imagine that it will be.
Just a couple of things to add there. One thing is, again, we just mentioned the currency. Obviously, if it's going to be a cheaper pound in the short term, it could really help British manufacturers sell overseas. Plus, incoming tourists to the UK, if the pound keeps on collapsing, it's going to be a real boost to the British tourist industry. One of the side effects it may have is, obviously, we're going to get rid of the, whether this is good or bad, it depends on your political slants, but we're obviously we're going to lose the Cameron-Osborne austerity government there. Whether Johnson or May or Gove or whoever comes in as Prime Minister, I get the feeling, and of course with the short-term turmoil, there could be a lot more spending, there could be a different kind of fiscal approach in the UK. So whether that's a good or bad thing, that's down to the individual, but that could certainly change.
Okay, gentleman here at the front.
Sadaki Novata, retired diplomat. People have been discussing what's been happening over the past 10 years or so. If I may speak personally, I was first exposed to Britain in the 1960s at Oxford, then at the embassy. Then I was back there in the 1990s at the embassy. When I left London in 1997, I was rather optimistic about the future of Japan-UK relationship. We thought of London as the gateway to Europe. It has changed. Britain has changed since then. But I've been saying that Britain has become more diversified but a multicultural dynamic society. Has it all gone downhill to the extent that we have to think about throwing Britain under a slow-moving London bus?
Americans haven't beaten you to it, apparently. So the crux of the question is about Japan-UK bilateral relations going forward.
I was trying to put it as gently as possible.
Okay.
Let me first just clarify my previous remark about under a bus. In terms of international relations, and that you phrased it as a comparison between US and remaining Europe and US-UK. That's the context I was meaning in. I sincerely hope there will continue to be a good relationship between the US and the UK. To come back to your point, London's an amazing, diverse, multicultural city, and the trouble is that you go to post-industrial northern cities and they're not diverse, multicultural, economically successful places. So it's that division that has led to this. In terms of Japan-UK relations, I think they'll be fine. But, and again, coming back to your point about the US relationship, the trouble is that Britain seems just increasingly distracted by these internal conflicts and less able to play a meaningful international role. So I hope again that Japan and the UK will remain good friends, but I wonder how useful that relationship will continue to be to Japan in the future, because seriously, we've got to think about these things. If Scotland leaves the UK, will the UK keep a seat on the UN Security Council? That's an open question. It distresses me a lot to think about it, but it's time to start thinking about things like that.
I think we had some questions right at the back. I see a hand sort of in the middle towards the back.
Hello, Min-Sik Kim. I am a poli-sci major in TUJ. It's a question about the domestic politics of the UK. How do you see the Labour and Tory parties changing in the next few years, considering that Corbyn is seeing a possible revolt within his own party with a possible no-confidence vote coming in later this year, and Cameron also resigning, he said, close to October this year. So do you see more pro-Leave MPs being elected in the future, or the opposite? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a very good question. So I think that there is a significant chance that there would be a major realignment in British politics. That there is even the possibility of, completely new parties coming into being, kind of splits in the original ones. It's difficult to imagine. We get so used to studying British politics as it is, but you just need to look at Spain to see that new parties can appear from almost nowhere and transform the political scene. Now, I'd like to see a sort of centrist, pro-European, pro-kind of union party emerge that would suddenly become enormously popular. Unfortunately, I don't really see that as being realistic. But what's clear is that both the Conservatives and the Labour Party have major divisions, major problems. All of the attention over the last few days has been elsewhere, but the Labour Party is self-destructing at the moment. And there are questions as to whether Corbyn will remain the leader of the party. We don't know exactly what would happen, but he has, after all, the backing of a huge number of grassroots Labour supporters. After all, that's why he has the position. So he would be quite difficult to unseat for that reason. So yeah, I think that it will be major realignments, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at predicting what they will be.
Having watched some of the news coverage of comments following the referendum from the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, I don't see a realignment on the centre-left of British politics. I saw the leader of the Liberal Democrats very quickly criticising the Labour Party as well as the Conservative Party, sort of positioning politically. So I don't see any realignments probably happening on the centre-left in the near future. And I think if the centre-left do want to make a positive case for Britain staying in Europe or going back into Europe at some point in the future, then there does probably need to be that realignment, especially if we keep the existing electoral system in the UK. And perhaps if Scotland leaves, that will reopen the discussion about the electoral system for the remaining parts of Britain.
Just to add something on that, and going back to what I said at the beginning, the big problem is that the Remain and Leave coalitions are completely different to the parties in Britain. And I think the Labour Party has the bigger problem, because the Labour Party's traditional supporters are working class people, and they're the ones who voted Leave. The other part of the Labour's coalition is minorities and professionals, and they voted Remain. And so I really don't see how the parties quickly align themselves into sort of Leave, Remain positions. Maybe that's something that could happen in UK politics, but I think it will take quite a while to get there.
Just one thing I'd like to add about the Labour Party. It's less than 10 years ago that the Labour Party had a very pro-Europe leader, Tony Blair, as James pointed out earlier, and a large portion of working-class British voters did vote for Tony Blair. So although at the moment everybody's talking about the European Union and Brexit, and this has been, I think, high on people's list of things to think about, I don't know if on a day-to-day basis this issue is as significant for a lot of voters as other issues to do with maybe inequality in the economy, for example. And if the Labour Party or a centre-left party that includes Labour and some of the other parties can reinvent themselves talking about those issues, I think they could be successful in keeping together the centre-left coalition that delivered victories for Blair and to some extent for Gordon Brown as well. And sat right in the centre.
Hi, Nancy Snow. I'm a Donald Trump watcher. And I'm a professor at Kyoto Gaidai. But nobody has asked this, and that is, wasn't the Leave communication I mean, didn't you all expect it was going to be leave? And it just seemed like the messaging went awry. It was brought up earlier, there wasn't this education of the importance of the membership in the EU. So where did it all go wrong? And nobody has brought up Joe Cox. I mean, the horrible murder of the MP the week before, I think a lot of people expected, well, this will definitely generate an uptick in the stay or the, remain. That was so tragic, and it almost seemed to perhaps have been overplayed somewhat. I'm just interested in sort of the advertising, because it didn't shock me. The outcome didn't shock me because I wasn't getting, even here in Japan, a sense of, okay, why stay? I want the compelling reason too. So what's the answer to that? Thank you.
Anybody want to start with that one?
Well, I mean, it might be worth asking, apart from causing instability, disrupting the status quo, how would you make the case for the European Union in Britain? I mean, we could argue first that it wasn't about the European Union. That's an important point. But, given that, how would you make the case? I'm not sure I would know how. Avoiding instability is not a great reason. I mean, it's a very conservative reason. And I mean, this is particularly difficult for Labour, who were pro-EU in the Blair years, but 15, 20 years before that, in fact, before Delors and the social market, they were very hostile to the EU. So, I mean, the left have always been conflicted about the EU. Well, no, the left haven't. The centre-left have been conflicted. The hard left have always been against it. So I don't know, how do you make the case for the EU? Because it's not a social democratic union. There's no social democratic reasons for supporting it.
Right. I mean, I think one of Nancy's questions was about the way that the Remain campaign in particular was portrayed. Why didn't they get more traction in the media? And I think, to be fair to the British media or part of the British media, like Robin's newspaper or Andy's news agency, there was actually a lot of really good reporting on what Brexit might mean, and also a lot of fact-checking of some of the misinformation or disinformation that was put out by certain politicians during the campaign. But as you know, Nancy, from watching Donald Trump, how you say it is often more important than what you say. And if people want to believe the message that you're giving, then quite often they'll buy into that. So I think that was part of the problem. The one person I saw who I thought did make a really compelling case for staying was Gordon Brown, who is marginally more popular than Tony Blair in Britain, but possibly not much. I think he's much more popular in Scotland than he is in the rest of the United Kingdom. But he made a very good case that actually a lot of British values are reflected in the European Union. Britain was a birthplace of free trade, and that's something that the European Union has embraced. Britain's encouraged the enlargement of the European Union, which has helped to embed democracy in a lot of former communist states within Eastern Europe. So Britain should be proud of the impact that it's had on the European Union. Like, these are our institutions that we've shaped with our norms and values. And that, to me, sounded like a very positive case. But he was the one politician that I saw putting that case. And I thought, what a shame that kind of message wasn't taken up by more individuals, with a positive message rather than the scaremongering that we did see from a large number of those fronting the Remain campaign.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for your inputs. Albert Kirchmann, automotive industry. I have 2 remarks and 2 questions. The remark number 1 goes to the American friend somewhere here. I totally disagree that Angela Merkel is coming here into play with some negativum. We can discuss this separately for a long time. But I may a little bit given why. Because first of all, I think she is the one fighter with personal risk fighting for the European Union. And who knows the German politic internally with fights against their own sister party and so on and so forth. Number 2, there comes something into play, which is humanity. And this we can discuss when we talk about immigrants. Number 2, second remark, I find it remarkable that the American friend and the Japanese friend are fishing somehow for Britain, Germany. Whom should we do? Whom should we throw under the bus? I'm not blaming you, yeah? I would expect that you are thinking in European Union when we talk about European Union. I would expect that Brussels is your first address.
Sir, can we maybe get to the question, because we only have about 5 minutes left, please. So if we could just put a question. Please do put the question, because we are running out of time and we have many others.
The question is very short, the two questions. How would you attract in future financial investments for industry? Question number one. And question number two, what role plays for you the Buckingham Palace?
Could you clarify the second part of the question? Sorry, I hurried you, and then we didn't hear it appropriately.
It costs a lot of money in the Buckingham Palace, and everybody's.
Oh, I see.
So, what role can they play in future to wind this a little bit?
I think none of us were sort of in royalist mode. I think that was the problem. Jump in on those 2 points.
Trade, it's impossible to say until we know what Britain's trading arrangements are. It's totally different if you have access to the single market or you don't. So I just think we have to wait to see on that. The Queen, I guess, is one of the last things which still ties the United Kingdom together. So we'll have to see what people think about the monarchy in the event that Scotland does indeed leave.
Okay, we're quite short on time, so let's just maybe take 3 questions together to wrap up. Yeah, okay, so we'll take one at the front here. The gentleman standing up at the back, because you're right in my eye line. And let's take the gentleman also at the back on this side as well. So those three questions. If you could make your way swiftly to the microphone, it would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Murata. I'm working for a Japanese bank. Just two rather technical question. To apply to the Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, does the new Prime Minister will need the support of the Parliament? Because on the Guardian article, it was written that it's royal purgatory, so it doesn't need a Parliament support. And the second one is called Lord Hill, who is a European Commissioner, was forced to resign on Saturday. And do you think that it will affect the city's financial stability or strength? Thank you.
I actually think Lord Hill, as far as I'm aware, resigned voluntarily rather than being forced to quit. But perhaps, seeing the direction of travel, decided it's the right time to go. Can we take our next question? And we'll group them all together. So. And we have one more question at the back. Sir, do you want to come forward and ask your question after this gentleman? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Richard, TJ alumni, and I was curious as to what options Scotland would have if they gained independence in terms of currency and standing up a central bank of their own or entering the euro.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the questions we have. Firstly, Article 50, does the Prime Minister need to consult Parliament? Secondly, does Lord Hill's resignation affect the city? And thirdly, what currency do we think Scotland, if it became independent, might use? Okay.
Okay, so with the Scottish one, that there's quite a significant difference from what was originally believed would be the case if Scotland became independent from what might happen now. So when we had the referendum on independence, it was believed, and it was a campaign issue for the Scottish National Party, that they would want to continue to use the pound. Mm-hmm. It's been suggested now, however, that if Scottish membership of the EU came as a result of the UK leaving the club and Scotland becoming a member subsequent to that, then that option wouldn't be available, and instead Scotland would be expected to have its own currency. With the additional likelihood that they would then have to commit to join the euro at a later date, something which is not popular within Scotland. So again, just another layer of uncertainty.
It's my understanding that the Prime Minister doesn't have to consult Parliament, that this is something that the Prime Minister can decide unilaterally, or the new Prime Minister, whoever that may be. Does anybody want to talk about the effect on the city of Lord Hill's resignation?
I mean, it will clearly have an effect on the city in that Franco-German Eurozone interests will now set financial regulations for the whole of the European Union, including London. But that's what Brexit means. It means you leave and you give up any say on the regulations. And yet we want to continue selling things into Europe, so we have to accept the rules. And fundamentally, that just defines what this is all about.
I think maybe Brexit means that you leave might be a good note for us to end our discussions this evening. Brexit means that we all now leave. So thank you very much for this evening.